Hi, this is Professor Marsh, and this is Unit 11 in Business Ethics at Newberry College in the fall of 2021. Uh, this chapter is about ethics and marketing, and this is really, I think, one of the most important chapters in our book. It begins with a series of quotes, and they're good ones. Uh, don't find customers for your products, find products for your customers. Seth Godin is quoted as saying that. A magazine is simply a device to induce people to read advertising. That's James Collins. Uh, there's one from Jeff Bezos, the richest person in the world, according to Forbes magazine. He said, if you make customers unhappy in the physical world, they might each tell six friends. If you make customers unhappy on the internet, they can each tell 6,000 friends. And F.W. Woolworth, who I don't know if any of you remember or know who that was, but at one time, virtually every town in America of any size had a Woolworth's five and dime store. He says, I am the world's worst salesman, therefore I must make it easy for people to buy. And that's certainly was true. The cold opening for this chapter is digital ethics and marketing. And Seth Godin is described, he might be the king of the theory of digital marketing, and perhaps maybe one of the princes of the practice of digital marketing, having fun in a very nerdy way while he's making money from dot-com startups and selling 19 books, many of which were big bestsellers. His blog is one of the most popular business marketing and innovation sites on the web, and it has been for over a decade. If you feel a little nerdy yourself, just find a picture of this guy. He looks like the grown-up version of Diary of a Nerdy Kid, but all of his fun and game playing has a point, and he knows how to monetize everything he does on the internet. A very smart guy. Okay, so the digital marketing, digital ethics and marketing, it's not so much a case study like the other cold openings in the book, as well as it's a well-written essay on marketing moving into the digital age. And indirect marketing was the state of the art for a long time, using television, radio, newspapers, and magazines to reach a broad audience. Hoping to find some customers were among all of them. Digital technologies today allow advertisers to segment markets down to the level of individuals and their web browsing and purchasing behavior of the last few minutes. And there's two factors related to this. One is mobile devices, and two is social networks. And there are ethical concerns about this too, possibilities of deception, manipulation, unfairness, or loss of privacy, which is very important to me as an attorney. It's fair to say that is maybe unfortunate surpluses at the start of an otherwise brilliantly written and editing essay. Did any of you writers notice that as well? So these are our chapter objectives. This is chapter 8, and it's Unit 11. Applying an ethical framework to marketing issues is one. Three key concerns of ethical analysis. We'll talk about that. Two interpretations of responsibility and product safety. Contractual standards, something I can perhaps shine some light on for business responsibility for safe products. Tort standards, also something that's kind of right up my alley for safe products. And strict liability and the ethical arguments for and against. We'll also talk about influencing through advertising, ethical and also unethical means, and the ethical justification for advertising. Also, advertising influence on consumer autonomy, and ethical and unethical target marketing, and then business's responsibility for the activities of its supply chain. So this is got a lot of stuff. It's got 11 chapter objectives, but it's a very meaty chapter with a lot of information about the history and current practice of marketing. If you go onto an MBA program, you'll have at least one course just in marketing. It's traditionally one of the favorite courses because it integrates mathematical concepts with persuasive writing, glib and funny catchphrases, and creative design. So it appeals to both the scientists and the poets among you. Apply an ethical framework to marketing issues. So take a look at table 8.1 on page 291, and you'll see that market exchange is prima facie ethically legitimate because there's a respect for autonomy and mutual benefit. But this ethical judgment is conditional. It's only a prima facie case because the transaction must be truly voluntary. There can't be any fraud or duress. Informed consent is needed. The benefits that are expected might not occur, and other values may conflict. And those four conditions imply four questions, which we'll get to on the next slide. But just to make sure that the exchange is ethical, we need to establish that the agreement was informed and voluntary, and the consent wasn't obtained by the use of fraud, deception, or coercion. And market exchange can be ethical under both the utilitarian and rights-based frameworks. An ethicist using justice or equity framework might say otherwise, but it might need to. Four conditions imply four questions. So one, is the exchange voluntary? Is consent to the exchange really informed? Are people truly benefited? And then the competing values might be justice, market failures, externalities, virtue, that sort of thing. So many of the criticisms the justice or equity framework might have are addressed in these questions on table 8.1. For example, are vulnerable customers being targeted? Are there fundamentally unsafe products? Or is the market inefficient because of market power of sellers or lack of acceptable substitutes, or a systemic bias against some market participants? So those are all questions about the market exchange and whether the marketing is ethically supportable. So the three key concerns of ethical analysis of marketing are a rights-based ethical tradition. To what extent do the market participants, the market participants are respected as free and autonomous? The utilitarian tradition, to what degree were actual and not just apparent benefits actually provided? In every ethical tradition, including virtues, equity, justice, what other values might be at stake in the transaction? I want to note the great discussion on impulse, the great discussion, and also the really funny cartoon about impulse buying. It's a real psychological phenomenon, and one which is encouraged by all retail chains. Just look at the stuff that they put at the checkout lines, the celebrity magazines, candy bars for the kids in tow, the gadgets and the other stuff they sell as you're finishing your shopping, things you would never have on your list of stuff that you actually need. And the cartoon about the shopper buying, how to stop impulse buying, it just reminds me that my wife has littered our house full of books on feng shui. Think about that for a minute. So two interpretations of responsibility and product safety. One meaning for responsibility is that it's the cause of something that happened. Hurricane Michael was responsible for millions of dollars in damages along the coast. Another meaning is the accountability for something that has happened. Who's going to be held accountable? So FEMA and its flood insurance program will be responsible for the costs of cleanup of the coast after Hurricane Michael. Contract law liability versus tort liability. Who will be held responsible? Is there is there a breach of contract that would lead to damages under the contract? Would those damages include consequential damages that are going to benefit perhaps for matters that weren't in the contract but that flow out of the breach of contract? Tort law liability. Who was the danger foreseeable, and did the defendant exercise due care? And then there's strict liability for products liability, which is who do we hold responsible even when no one broke a promise or committed a wrong? And just note in the law that there are these three forms of liability that you have to think about, and that are part of what businesses typically purchase liability insurance to insure against. Contract law standards of liability for a breach of a promise, tort liability for negligence, which is often insured. Sometimes contract law liability can't be insured. Intentional wrongful behavior is another type of tort liability. And then also strict liability. Who pays for a loss when there's no breach and nobody's committed any bad act. So let's look at the contractual standards for business responsibility for safe products. And for a long time, the contractual standards were the only standards. Was there, at common law, the rule was caveat emptor, buyer beware. Every purchase has informed consent of the buyer and the seller, and so it's ethically legitimate. And so that was the standard at traditional law. And then what developed in the law is an implied warranty of merchantability, an implied assurance by a seller that a product that the seller is selling is reasonably suitable for its purpose, that the Vegematic won't break the first time you try to chop up a carrot. The lemon laws for automobiles, those sorts of things. Note that frequent disclaimers of implied warranties in the sale of many products, or the fancy limited warranties in the sale of products, which are actually a disclaimer of the implied warranties provided by law. So they're limiting their warranties. They're giving you a limited warranty, and in the process they are disclaiming the implied warranties that you would otherwise be entitled to under the law. Now, the tort standards for safe products, also at traditional law, were negligence, unintentional failure to exercise reasonable care not to harm another person. So the harm caused was foreseeable, but the defendant failed to exercise due care. That's negligence. And there's a recklessness standard, which sometimes permits higher damages, maybe punitive damages or consequential damages. And recklessness is extreme negligence, but not intentional harm. Really unreasonable negligence, not simply a careless mistake. And then there's intentional harm, which is willful and deliberate infliction of harm. That can be things like assault and battery or fraud or deception, those sorts of things. And then strict product liability, holds that the producer of a product which creates damage, even if there was no contractual or tort liability on the part of the producer. And, this could be, anything that maybe is a product that is legal, but is perhaps unnecessarily dangerous. I know that there have been attempts to impose strict liability against the manufacturers of firearms. Nuclear power is one that is subject to claims for strict liability. So, and a lot of products liability, jurisprudence is strict liability. The supporters of strict liability say that strict liability creates an incentive for producers to create safe products, and producers are best able to bear the cost of strict liability since they have the revenue for selling the product, so they can adjust the price so that they collect enough for their good products that'll pay, where if there's problems or damages created by bad products. And then they'll learn to create good products so that they don't have to pay those damages. Opponents of strict liability answer, if the product was safe and legal that created the harm, how can incentives actually work, right? So if it was tested, it was safe and legal, perhaps, it got the UL label on it, and those sorts of things. Maybe it was maybe it's a drug. Maybe it was a drug that was reviewed and tested and found to be safe and effective by the FDA. So how can those incentives work if the product was safe and legal? And then also opponents of strict liability answer that government is best able to bear the cost. Lots of businesses have been put out of business by product liability claims, even when they did nothing wrong, and that seems unfair. So the law assumes that every wrong needs a remedy. That's really the trend in modern law, and that the injured consumer is not able to bear the cost of the loss. But is that really true? Think of it a different way. Think about it for can you assume the risk anymore? Can you sign a document that says we assume the risk? What if somebody goes up on Elon Musk's or Richard Branson's spaceship and it crashes through no fault of design or construction, but simply because it was hit by an asteroid? Would Musk or Branson be responsible? Should they? Or are these kind of daredevil explorers? Can they limit their liability, or will strict liability be imposed? So that's an issue that we get into in business quite often. I know that I've had many businesses that have been starting up that have asked us to draft liability waivers that waive all claims for someone's participation in an activity in which they could be injured, or for the use of a product or service in which there's a possibility that through no fault of the promoter, but somebody could get injured. Think about it. If you do a 5K race, somebody could trip on the sidewalk, break their ankle, or maybe the security guard or police at the intersection doesn't properly control either pedestrians or even vehicles, and there's some sort of an accident. At that point, are you going to impose liability? And would a waiver that's in the entry form, would that be effective? So those are issues that we get into in that area in marketing. I'm not sure how much those are really hard ethical questions. If you, I'm of the perspective that probably tort liability is excessive in modern society. I think the United States is probably the most litigious society there is, and there are certainly ethical questions that I have about the lobbying by trial lawyers to avoid limitations on liability. And people sue for kind of crazy things and get recoveries for them. So I am probably somewhat concerned about the ethics of the law in this area. But if we're just talking about marketing and sales, there's certainly enough bad marketing, and that it does need to to have some standards, and to have some accountability for people who step over the line. So let's move on to influencing through advertising, ethical and unethical means. So ethical means will include persuading, asking, informing, and advising. And unethical means can include threats, coercion, deception, manipulation, and lying. Now, manipulation is subtle direction or management to influence behavior. Manipulation isn't persuading or advising, it's bypassing the target individual's autonomy and reasoned judgment. Uh, you can have those, uh, um, you know, advertisements that have the hidden messages in them that apparently your brain recognizes, even though you don't really read it, and those sorts of things. The messages that are embedded inside of the Muzak that you hear in the stores telling you to buy, buy, buy. I'm not sure that's always effective or something that is really um, might be more legend than fact. Uh, Note that market research, especially political market research, will test several types of approaches to see which version of the truth, otherwise known as which lie, is more persuasive and makes the consumer or voter more receptive to, vote for the candidate or, perhaps purchase the product. And consider digital marketing and the algorithms purchased and used to skew search results or views or placement on social media such as Facebook and Twitter, and the ethical issues created by those practices. The ethical justification for advertising is discussed in your book and in this chapter, and there's several of them. Advertising provides information for market exchanges and therefore contributes to market efficiency and to overall happiness. This is the utilitarian or Kantian ethical standards. A traditional defense of advertising is ethical. Advertising information also contributes to the information necessary for autonomous individuals to make informed choices. That's another traditional defense. A rights-based or principle-based criticism would note the manipulative influence of deceptive advertising, using advertising as a means to an end of a beneficial sale for the advertiser. And then also another criticism is just targeting vulnerable populations, like marketing cigarettes to children. It's a particularly egregious violation of ethical principles to someone who cannot exercise reasoned, autonomous judgment. Digital marketing can be ethically supported when it is targeted. It's targeting known interests to the consumer, like sending somebody who's just searched for a flight to a city, say Montreal, and the digital marketing then sends him advertising of hotel fares where the person might stay while in Montreal. That would be considered probably both virtuous and helpful. But marketing to target fears, anxieties, and whims of consumers, or perhaps addictive behavior too, would be considered unethical, particularly vulnerable consumers, such as selling high-cost burial insurance to older customers. Advertising's influence on consumer autonomy. So supporters say it provides information to consumers, information that contributes to an efficient market. We've looked at that already. And that the market will expose deceptive advertising. And I think we find that's true. When we have deceptive advertising, eventually it is it is exposed and removed. And social media hastens the exposure of frauds. And in times of rapid change, advertising lets consumer know of improvements in products and services in real time. I may have added that one myself. Critics note the dependence effect on advertising, that people become dependent on advertising, and it's creating demand for products that producers make. John Kenneth Galbraith was one of the more eloquent and persistent critics of advertising. He was a academic, a professor at Harvard, and he was around and writing when I was in college, and I thought he was basically an eloquent idiot. But in any event, he was a critic of advertising, among many other things, including capitalism. He was a critic of that as well. Uh, and Demand is a function of supply. If advertisers can cause consumers to seek out what's being produced, now that really can invert the supply and demand equation, and it can be bad economics. So if advertising becomes too pervasive, too powerful, uh, you know, you can affect the market and perhaps make it less effective and efficient than it otherwise would. So anyhow, that's probably a valid criticism. Ethical and unethical target marketing. The book then describes marketing to vulnerable populations, which we've talked about: cigarettes to children, burial insurance to older people, uh, alcohol to alcoholics. If you got somebody's got the secret list of AA participants and then started sending them Jim Beam ads or something. Uh, Target marketing, which takes advantage of known consumer beliefs and behaviors and presents products likely to appeal to those consumers, though, is ethical. Less ethical are those ads which appear to take advantage of vulnerable populations' fears, irrational or not, to sell a product which might not be necessary. So one of the ones that we see in the book is that ad about "I've fallen and I can't get up," and you're really just playing to fears which may be irrational. Even less ethical are ads targeting groups who can't make informed choices, like children. And then you've got stealth or undercover marketing, marketing campaigns that are based on environments or activities where the subject is not aware that he or she is the target of a marketing campaign. And the book gives you the example of Ericsson's new mobile phone photo app feature that when it came out, they sent 60 actors around the Empire State Building in New York City to shill the feature, and that description of how they did it is worth reading, and I'll leave that to all of you. Okay, business responsibility for activities of its supply chain. So you have the Nike example. Nike was subject to intense international criticism for the manufacturing practices of its suppliers, even though Nike only designed and marketed the shoes that others produced, but they were produced in countries around the world where workers had very little rights and were paid very little, and were treated like sweatshops. Similar concept to respondeat superior, let the master answer for the action of his agents. That's the concept that would hold businesses responsible for the activities of down the chain suppliers. Note the great diagram of the multinational corporation supply chain and the stakeholders of Figure 8.1. That's really that's a great schematic representation of the stakeholders involved in a large corporation supply chain. And I just wanted to add, one of the funniest things I ever saw was comedian Ricky Gervais at the 2020 Golden Globes Award, calling out the people in the audience. And one of the ones there, Apple had gotten into producing entertainment. So he congratulated Tim Cook on the morning show or whatever the one is with Reese Witherspoon and Jennifer Aniston that they make. I've never seen it, but telling how wonderful this was a new comedy or new, show about the high ethical standards involved in broadcasting, and then saying that Apple was a company that made products in sweatshops in China, and seemed rather ironic that they were talking about ethics in their entertainment. But anyhow, you have to get I put a link in my notes to the joke that he made at Apple's expense. right in Tim Cook's face, which was quite satisfying. Okay, over the years, marketing and advertising in the 1930s through the 1950s was really the beginning of the modern advertising agency, and some of the people who were involved were, Bruce Barton was DDBO, and I'm sorry, BBDO was the big advertising agency on Madison Avenue. And he became quite a figure in popular culture to the point that when FDR ran for re-election in 1940, he actually had a stump speech, and he called Barton out by name. Barton was kind of a pro Boy Scouts, pro Bible conservative, and FDR obviously was not his cup of tea either. But Bruce was a very, very successful business person, and if you ever look up his Wikipedia entry, you can see the way his persuasiveness when he was raising money to save and to endow Berea College. It's a classic letter, solicitation letter for a fundraising drive, and I just really I still look at that and think how amazing that was. Maybe somebody at Newberry should copy it and send it out to our prospective boosters. But that was the 1930s, 1950s, and in the early 1960s, there was a Hollywood movie with Doris Day and Rock Hudson, which is a classic. And I know you all are too young to remember this, but somebody should track it down and watch it. Maybe on YouTube or if it's on any of the streaming services. It was called Lover Come Back, and it was about dueling advertising agencies that were fighting to get the account for a product which didn't exist, and it's a funny kind of romantic comedy, and has a lot of references to advertising of the day. Sort of the 1960s were when Mad Men, which was a show from just 15 or so years ago, but that's actually the 1960s is when it is set, and I've had some experiences with some of the people who were the Mad Men on Madison Avenue back in the 1960s. In fact, I had a client I administered the estate for. The fellow who taught Ed McMahon how to pour a beer so it looked beautiful on the Johnny Carson show. And he had the Budweiser account for New York City and was at the absolute pinnacle of the advertising world and had just such a tremendous career and so many great experiences in that business. When I think when he took over the Budweiser account for Anheuser-Busch, it was number 7 in New York City, and when he got finished showing off Ed McMahon and Michelob on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show, which at that time was based in New York, it was the number 1 beer in New York and became the number 1 beer in America as well. And what happened is when he retired from his advertising agency, apparently the story is that Mr. Bush went to him and said, okay, here's a map of the United States. Pick the territory you want, and gave him a Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch distributorship in the jurisdiction that he wanted it. So anyhow, it can be a very lucrative profession as well. And a lot of you who go into business may start in marketing. It's traditionally a place that in a larger organization that the younger people go into, sales and marketing, and as they learn the business, they learn it by learning the products and the customers, and so it's a great area to be in. But there are ethical challenges, and that's what we're talking about in this course. So that's it for this particular part of the course. This was Unit 11, and we will have Unit 12 and 13 in short order and that'll finish up the book for us. So have a great day. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.